The international non-governmental organisation Human Rights Watch has reported that security forces in Cameroon have arrested, beaten or threatened at least 24 people for alleged consensual same-sex conduct or gender non-conformity since February 2021. The organisation says that at least one of the victims was forced to undergo an HIV test. For more on this, we are joined by Graeme Reid from the Human Rights Watch. Graeme, very good afternoon, or good morning rather. You're speaking to us from New York. Certainly talk to us about these challenges that members of the LGBTIQ plus community are facing in Cameroon.
Yes, certainly. We've been documenting over a period of many years the arbitrary arrests that people in Cameroon face on a perception that they are gay or transgender. The most recent cases that we've documented have been people who've basically been subject to mob violence, and then they themselves have been arrested and subject to ill treatment while in detention. But this is something that has been going on for many years. Cameroon is one of the countries that does enforce its criminal penalties and has systematically arrested people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. This takes place in a context in which many countries within Africa do criminalize same-sex activity. As you know, that most of these laws are relics of a colonial period, and in some instances the laws are not directly enforced in that people are not arrested, but still the laws send a very negative message and they create a climate in which violence and discrimination flourishes.
Now, Graeme, talk to us about how you marry the two scenarios. So obviously, as Human Rights Watch, you feel that this is an infringement on the rights of these individuals. The laws of the country, particularly of these African countries, suggest otherwise.
Well, the laws contradict international human rights law. And as the African Commission, has brought out a strong statement condemning violence and discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and there's a trend towards decriminalization. I think, that we tend to focus on documenting abuses against LGBT people, but the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia is also a time to reflect on progress. And I think that we have seen progress also within Africa in terms of decriminalization. Just last year, the Angolan Penal Code finally came into effect, and that decriminalizes same-sex activity and also offers protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, last year, the Botswana Appeals Court upheld an earlier ruling that decriminalized same-sex activity in Botswana. And Botswana was an interesting place because even though same-sex activity was criminalized, they still had protection for employment, for example, based on sexual orientation. So, it is a mixed bag. We also saw in 2020, Gabon decriminalized, having introduced a law just a year previously that for the first time outlawed same-sex activity. And there's also a challenge in Mauritius. So, we are seeing a trend building also on what Mozambique that decriminalized in 2015. So there is also progress and development within Africa that is moving towards decriminalization. On the other hand, we see a place like Ghana, which has really introduced a bill that is extreme and that would actually outlaw even just saying that you're gay or lesbian would come with a prison term.
Now, Graeme, we obviously noticed when Human Rights Watch raises its hand to say that these violations are occurring in certain countries against specific individuals of the LGBTQI plus community. But talk to us about the work that you're doing around advocacy, and that's creating awareness, certainly to the individuals that eventually would perpetrate these crimes.
Right. Well, we are a group that works internationally, but we always work with groups who are based in country, local organizations who understand the political situation in that particular setting and who also have very clear ideas about what their goals are. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. What we do is to work in a particular context in order to seek the advances that groups within that country are looking for. And, we've seen over the last 2 decades an enormous growth in LGBT organizations across the continent who are very well organized, who are coming up with very innovative strategies for advancing their rights and preventing the kind of violence and discrimination that you mentioned, for example, in Cameroon. I would think, for example, of the situation in Rwanda, where the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was scheduled to take place, and we've documented the roundup of people who are regarded as socially undesirable ahead of that international meeting, and that included people who identify as gay or transgender, who were held temporarily in a detention center. Now, we would use that in order to raise awareness about the situation in Rwanda at a time when there's international attention on that particular situation. And also the reports that we produce, which is documenting and producing the evidence of abuse, discrimination, and violence that occurs, are then used by others, by local groups, and for strategic litigation purposes to incrementally bring about change in various different settings. I think, for example, in Kenya, where there's been an ongoing challenge to the law that outlaws same-sex activity in Kenya, and that is currently up for appeal. Our work there has been to document the effects of this law in terms of the violence and discrimination that people experience on a regular basis there.
Now, while this is not centered specifically on Africa, we certainly know that the authorities in Qatar have already put out a warning to individuals who come in there of the same-sex relations. What does that sort of thing do to the progress that organizations in the LGBTQI space are making, both on the continent and elsewhere?
Well, of course, there's a responsibility for the international sporting bodies to ensure that the countries that are awarded the major sporting events are compliant, and there's a due diligence obligation to ensure that there's not going to be discrimination that takes place associated with major sporting events. And so we do a lot of work around that at Human Rights Watch, not only focusing on LGBT issues, but on also the broader human rights climate and environment in these particular country settings. But of course, something like that sends a very negative message, but we're mostly concerned about what about the LGBT residents in Qatar and the kinds of enduring experiences that they have there outside of the context of the sporting event.
Now, final question. Talk to us about which African countries, in your view, have been most progressive as far as rights of the queer community are concerned.
Well, of course, South Africa has set the precedent with its constitutional protection, although we're very aware of the ongoing scourge of violence, that gender-based violence that's broad-based in South Africa, but that has a specific effect on LGBT people. There were some 24 documented cases of murder last year. But, South Africa has set a high bar in the region for legal protection based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We've certainly, as I mentioned, seen progress in Botswana. We've seen decriminalization both in Mozambique and in Angola. These are examples of countries that are moving in one direction. What I do find more disturbing is the kind of laws that had been passed in Uganda, Nigeria, and now a bill in Ghana that outlaws not just same-sex activity, but the very expression of identity. And I think those are laws that we need to watch very closely, because we've seen similar laws in Russia, in Hungary, that seek to go much further than previous laws by making it illegal simply to express your identity in any way, or to organize, or to try and advocate on your own behalf. And those are particularly disturbing developments.
Graeme Reid, Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from New York, as today marks International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. Thank you for your time.